France in the 19th century was experiencing an urban boom, entering its industrial age by the 1900s. Paris's elites essentially forced out the working class up and away from the city. In the book, The Rise of the Paris Red Belt, writer Tyler Stovall states that for the working class, attics, basements, and even stables were converted into apartments. While the rate of poverty was steadily growing, the upper classes were still upholding their cultural habits. It became increasingly difficult for many to find work, especially young women. Ballet was a common route for some small income. For many, it offered a hope for food, shelter, and a better life. Unfortunately, it was a false hope, as the competitive and exploitative nature of the Paris Opera Ballet, the heart of the ballet world, left these young women with no other choice than to resort to prostitution for a living wage. There was a special room at the Paris Opera Ballet called the Foyer de la Danse, where men would pay to fraternize with the ballerinas. They were encouraged to please the men, often by their own families. Edgar Degas was no stranger to this world. In fact, he frequented the practice rooms of the Paris Ballet and depicted the scenes as he saw them. In his painting Rehearsal of the Ballet on Stage, we get an onlooker's perspective with no omissions or idealization. He paints one dancer stretching her neck and yawning, another tucking the ribbons of her pointe shoes. On the far right, there are two men sat, sort of looming and leering over the dancers. They appear well-dressed, and their overly relaxed positions mirror the overall tone of the piece. It's a glimpse into their reality that feels similar to watching someone cook. It's an unflattering image. Many of the young dancers, or petite rats as they were called, and are still called, pursued art modeling as another means to source income. This was not ideal either, especially in the case of Degas. In the book Degas and His Model, written by Alice Michel, Pauline, a young artist model, details what it was like to work for Degas. She explains that she was made to hold an extremely difficult pose for quite some time, with poor pay and poor treatment. Degas chose not to clean his studio for fear that the dust would rise up and ruin his work. So Pauline's clothes and body would often be soiled after modeling. He also did not keep the space warm. At this time, Degas was losing his vision, and after the many times working on and in his mind failing a sculpture of Pauline, he sent her away, telling her, "We have nothing left to do together." In this pastel work by Degas, called Ballet 1876, he depicts another view of the stage. The ballerina seems to be in full dress, performing with other dancers waiting in the wings. Along with the other dancers, there is a tuxedoed man in the shadows. His face is concealed, so he appears as a kind of ghost on stage. Again, Degas seems to remind us of the figures literally lurking in the shadows of this incredibly popular pastime for the middle class. Not only are they watching the ballets and enjoying the dance, they're propositioning the girls and taking advantage of their lowly status. Charles Bernheimer illustrates for us in his journal article, Degas' Brothels, Voyeurism and Ideology, that indeed Degas portrayed these top-hatted messieurs, likely members of the jockey club with backstage access, eliciting the dancers from the coulisses, or what the Oxford Dictionary describes as that flat piece of scenery at the side of the stage, which is what we see pictured in Ballet 1876. These men that Degas portrayed were known as les abonnés, or the subscribers, and were largely responsible for keeping the theater afloat. The opera catered to them even in its programming, scheduling the ballet after the first act when they would be dining. In Deirdre Kelly's book, Ballerina, she writes that Degas depicted the little rats in their truth, not as sexual beings but as tired and spent athletes. The ballerinas were not regarded with admiration for their talent, but rather demoralized and gossiped about, and assumed to be prostitutes. Parisian society certainly failed its middle class, and the generations of young women who would have been lost to the world if not for Degas' obsessive documentation. Perhaps Degas was merely a product of his time. He was among the voyeurs of the jockey club within the Foyer de la Danse, but never seemed to participate outright in the debauchery. But perhaps he just couldn't afford it.